If someone had told me that locking my own gate would end with dump trucks legally rumbling past an HOA president's picture window 6 mornings a week, I'd have laughed and gone back to loading gravel. That's not how real life works. At least that's what I believed. Then one woman decided she could sell access to my private road without ever asking me. And by the time she realized she'd picked the wrong piece of land to play politics with, the county itself was approving the very traffic she begged them to stop. My name is Mason Calloway, and this whole mess started because someone mistook my silence for permission. My family owns 46 acres on the western ridge of Briar Hollow, a stretch of rocky hillside that's been in our family since my great-grandfather bought it after returning from the Korean War. It isn't fancy land. It's stubborn land. Cedar trees grow wherever they please. Limestone pushes through the dirt like old bones. And every spring the wildflowers somehow convince you life is simpler than it really is. The gravel road climbing from the county highway to my house wasn't built by the county or the state. My grandfather carved it out himself with a bulldozer he rebuilt from scrap. Every load of gravel, every drainage ditch, every culvert crossing came out of his own pocket. My father maintained it after him, and when he passed away, I inherited not only the property but every responsibility that came with it. I run a small stone and landscape supply business from the lower acreage. Nothing flashy. 2 employees, an aging loader that complains louder than my knees every winter, and enough steady customers to keep the lights on. Most days begin before sunrise with coffee on the porch, my blue Gila Ranger curled beside my boots, and a quiet that makes you forget the rest of the world exists. That quiet disappeared because of a woman named Denise Holloway. No relation despite the last name, something she'd remind people of with a laugh before explaining she married into it. Denise moved into the Ridgeview Preserve subdivision about 6 years earlier. Within a year she was HOA president. People described her as energetic, organized, passionate. Those are nice words. I learned that sometimes they also mean someone who genuinely believes every idea they have deserves to become everyone else's responsibility. At first we barely crossed paths. A wave at the mailbox, a polite hello at the hardware store. She'd compliment the scenery around my property every now and then, saying the ridge should be shared with more people because it was one of the prettiest overlooks in the county. I'd smile, thank her, and think nothing of it. Looking back, maybe I should have paid closer attention. The first warning came on a cool Saturday in April. I was stacking limestone pallets when I heard something that didn't belong out there. Not a pickup. Not farm equipment. A diesel engine, smooth, steady, heavy. I looked toward the road and saw a full-size sightseeing coach easing through my lower gate like it owned the place. Bright white paint, mountains painted across the side, tinted windows packed with tourists pointing cameras at the hills. For a second, I honestly thought the driver had taken a wrong turn. I walked over, waving him down. The driver smiled before I even said a word, opened the folding door, and asked, "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" I said, "Depends. Where exactly are you headed?" He looked surprised by the question. "The Briar Ridge Scenic Loop," he answered. "We've been running it every weekend." Then he held up a laminated route packet clipped beside his steering wheel. There it was in black ink. Callaway Ridge Road listed as an approved scenic section. I blinked twice, because surely I was reading it wrong. "Who approved this?" I asked. "The Ridgeview HOA," he replied casually. "Denise handled all the access paperwork months ago. It felt like somebody quietly reached inside my chest and twisted something. Months. I asked him how long he'd been driving that route. "Since last summer," he said. "Customers love it. Best overlook in the county." I looked past him at the smiling passengers taking pictures through the windows. None of them had done anything wrong. They bought tickets for a sightseeing tour. They had no reason to suspect they were sitting on private property. I kept my voice calm. "Sir, this road isn't public, it belongs to me. Nobody asked for permission because nobody has permission." His expression changed immediately. "Wait, what?" I nodded. "I'm afraid whoever sold you this route sold you something they didn't own." The poor guy looked genuinely embarrassed. He apologized 3 times before carefully turning the coach around. I even helped him back down because the last thing I wanted was 40,000 pounds of bus sliding into my fence. As the bus disappeared toward the highway, Ranger sat beside me staring after it like he couldn't figure out why a whale had wandered into the woods. Neither could I. That afternoon I called Denise. She answered cheerfully enough. "Mason, what can I do for you? You can explain why tour buses are driving up my private road." There was a pause. Not the pause of someone confused, but the pause of someone deciding which explanation sounded safest. Then she laughed softly. "Oh, that, I thought everyone understood the overlook had become part of the community experience." I frowned. "Community experience? People love the view, it benefits the whole area. Local businesses, property values, tourism." "Denise," I interrupted, "it's private property." Another pause. "It's always been treated like shared access." "By who?" I asked. Silence. "Can you send me the easement agreement?" I continued. "Or the county document, whatever says my road belongs to your HOA. Her voice cooled several degrees. "Not everything has to be written down, Mason. Sometimes neighbors cooperate." I leaned against the loader tire and stared at the hills my grandfather had spent half his life protecting. "Cooperation usually starts with asking." She sighed dramatically. "I'm sure we can work something out." "No," I replied quietly. "We can work something out after the buses stop." She ended the call politely enough, but I knew that tone. I'd heard it from contractors who thought they could outsmart written contracts. She believed she could simply talk her way around ownership. The following Saturday another coach appeared. Then another the weekend after that. I didn't stop them immediately. Instead, I grabbed my camera. I photographed license plates, company logos, tire tracks, timestamps, every single trip. My neighbor, Earl Maddox, wandered over while I was taking pictures. Earl had lived on the ridge longer than anyone except me. When I explained what was happening, he scratched his beard and looked confused. "I figured you had some agreement with the HOA," he admitted. "Denise told folks at one of their meetings the landowner was fully on board." I felt something inside me go strangely still. She hadn't just misled the tour company. She told an entire neighborhood I had agreed to something I'd never even heard about. That evening, I drove to the county records office. 3 hours later, I walked out carrying certified copies of every survey, every deed, every recorded easement attached to my property since the 1950s. There wasn't a single document giving anyone access. Not the county, not the subdivision, not Denise. Nobody. When I got home, I sat at my kitchen table long after midnight writing a certified letter. It was simple, factual, impossible to misunderstand. Stop using my road immediately. No permission exists. Any future commercial traffic will be considered trespassing. 7 days later, the signed receipt came back. Denise had received it. She never answered. The next Saturday, 3 buses climbed my road before noon. That was the morning I finally understood something important. This wasn't confusion anymore. This wasn't neighborly misunderstanding. Denise Holloway had decided my property belonged to her plans, and she fully expected me to accept it. She couldn't have known that decision was about to change both of our lives in ways neither of us could possibly imagine. The funny thing about standing your ground is that most people imagine it looks dramatic. They picture shouting matches, lawyers marching into courtrooms, maybe somebody slamming a stack of papers onto a polished table. Real life isn't usually that exciting. Most of the time, standing your ground looks like making copies, backing up security footage, writing down dates, and resisting the urge to lose your temper when someone is counting on exactly that. The morning after Martha showed me the flyer, I drove into town before sunrise and stopped at the little print shop that's been on Main Street longer than I've been alive. Frank, the owner, looked at the stack of documents in my hands and laughed. "Either you're writing the world's longest complaint letter," he said, "or somebody's about to have a very bad week." "I'm hoping for the second one," I answered. By the time I got home, I had 3 binders. One held property records dating back to my grandfather's original purchase. Another contained every survey, permit, and tax document I could find. The last one was empty except for labeled dividers: photos, videos, witnesses, incidents. If this was going to become a legal fight, I wanted facts, not opinions. My dad used to tell me that memories fade, but paperwork has a stubborn way of sticking around. A few days later, I added the first entry. My trail camera captured 2 residents cutting the chain that blocked an old maintenance road leading to the lake. They weren't trying to hide it either. One of them actually smiled at the camera as if he thought he had every right to be there. I recognized both men from the subdivision, but what caught my attention wasn't them. About 10 minutes later, Rebecca's SUV slowly drove past the same road. She stopped for nearly 30 seconds, watched the open gate, then continued without ever getting out. She had seen it. She knew exactly what had happened, and she did absolutely nothing. Daniel Rhodes, my attorney, watched the footage twice before leaning back in his chair. "This is better than I expected." "How's that?" I asked. "Because this isn't just trespassing anymore." He pointed at the screen. "If the HOA leadership knowingly encouraged unauthorized access to private property, they're creating liability for themselves. Think Rebecca realizes that?" He smiled. "People who get used to winning small arguments sometimes forget the law doesn't care how confident they sound." We decided not to send a demand letter yet. Instead, Daniel suggested something I hadn't considered. "Let's attend their next HOA meeting." I almost laughed. "I'm not a member." "Exactly. They'll throw me out." "Maybe," he replied, "but if they're discussing your property in an official meeting, I want witnesses." The clubhouse looked more like a ski lodge than an office. Stone fireplace, leather chairs, fresh cookies sitting on a table near the entrance. If you ignored the agenda, you'd think it was a community Christmas party. Rebecca noticed us the second we walked in. "Mr. Mercer," she said with a practiced smile, "this meeting is reserved for homeowners." Daniel stepped forward before I could answer. "Actually, we're here regarding agenda item 7. Her smile disappeared just enough to notice. "Excuse me, Community Fishing Day." Several people in the room looked down at their printed agendas. Rebecca hadn't expected that. "That's an internal community event." Daniel nodded politely. "Being held on my client's private property." The room became very quiet. Rebecca recovered quickly. "Our understanding is that residents have established recreational access." Daniel didn't argue. He simply placed a certified property survey on the table, then another, then aerial photographs, then county tax maps. Nobody said a word while people leaned forward to examine them. Finally, an older gentleman sitting near the back raised his hand. "Rebecca, are you saying this lake isn't actually inside the subdivision?" She hesitated. "Just for a second." "The situation is complicated." I couldn't help myself. "No," I said calmly, "it's actually pretty simple." Every head turned toward me. "You either own something or you don't." Rebecca closed the meeting less than 5 minutes later. On the drive home, Daniel chuckled to himself. "What?" I asked. "Did you notice something? 3 board members never looked at you." "So, they were looking at Rebecca." He glanced out the window. That's what people do when they realize someone they've trusted may not have told them the whole truth. Over the next week, the mood around the neighborhood shifted. A retired teacher named Helen knocked on my door carrying a pie she insisted I accept. "I owe you an apology," she said. "Rebecca told us your family had promised lake access years ago. We never did. I know that now." She looked embarrassed. Most of us never questioned it. That conversation repeated itself more than I expected. One neighbor admitted he'd assumed the HOA owned everything visible from the subdivision entrance. Another confessed he'd never even looked at the property maps before buying his home. Little by little, people began asking questions Rebecca clearly didn't want to answer. That's when things escalated. One Saturday morning, I woke to the sound of truck engines. 3 pickup trucks sat beside my east fence unloading folding tables, coolers, fishing poles, and bright green banners that read Maple Ridge Family Fishing Festival. Nearly 40 people had gathered before 9 o'clock. Children ran through the grass carrying tackle boxes while volunteers tied balloons to temporary signs. Rebecca stood in the middle of it all wearing a matching green polo shirt, greeting families like the host of a county fair. I drove over in my truck and parked a safe distance away. "Morning, Rebecca," she smiled without a hint of concern. "Good morning, Caleb. Beautiful day for bringing neighbors together. On my property, near your property," I laughed quietly. "We are still using that line." She folded her arms. "You're making this unnecessarily difficult by expecting people to stay off land they don't own." Several families had stopped unpacking to watch us. Rebecca noticed the audience and raised her voice just enough. "This community has enjoyed access to this lake for years." "Enjoying something," I answered, "doesn't magically transfer ownership." A father holding his daughter's fishing rod looked back and forth between us. "Wait, are we not supposed to be here?" Before Rebecca could answer, 2 sheriff's deputies rolled slowly down the gravel road behind them. Daniel had anticipated exactly this possibility and asked the county for a civil standby to prevent the situation from getting out of control. The deputies approached calmly, asking everyone to remain where they were while they verified property records. I handed over my survey. Rebecca handed over a glossy subdivision brochure. One deputy looked at it for several seconds before raising an eyebrow. "Ma'am," he said politely, "marketing material isn't a deed." You could almost feel the crowd shift. Parents who had arrived expecting a fun Saturday morning suddenly realized they might have been invited onto someone else's land under false pretenses. Rebecca's confidence cracked for the first time. She began insisting there had been misunderstandings, historical agreements, verbal permissions. But every explanation sounded weaker than the one before it. The deputies asked everyone to leave peacefully, and most did without argument. As cars slowly pulled away, I noticed something I'd never seen before. Rebecca wasn't angry. She looked worried, not because people had left, because they had started asking questions she could no longer answer. I watched the last vehicle disappear beyond the hill, and for the first time since this whole mess had begun, I had the unmistakable feeling that the real battle wasn't about fishing anymore. It was about whatever story had convinced an entire neighborhood to believe my family's lake belonged to someone else. And somewhere beneath that story, I was beginning to suspect, was a truth far more expensive than a community picnic by the time autumn rolled around. People in Ashcroft Valley had stopped talking about the fishing festival. They'd moved on to a different question entirely. Why had the Homeowners Association spent so much energy trying to convince everyone the lake belonged to the neighborhood in the first place? That question spread faster than any rumor Rebecca Lawson had ever managed to start. And unlike rumors, this one came with documents. Daniel and I filed a quiet request for public records, not because we expected fireworks, but because paperwork has a funny habit of telling the truth after people stop trying to impress each other. A week later, 2 cardboard boxes arrived from the county archives. Most of the records were exactly what you'd expect: old plats, engineering sketches, environmental permits, handwritten inspection notes from the early 80s. But buried inside one faded folder was something neither of us had expected to find. 20 years before Maple Ridge was ever built, the original developer had proposed a luxury subdivision that included my family's lake as its centerpiece. The proposal never happened because my grandfather refused to sell. The county rejected the revised plans and the project died, at least on paper. Daniel stared at the file for nearly a minute before speaking. "This explains everything. Explain it to me." Someone kept selling the dream long after they lost the right to sell it. Suddenly, every strange conversation over the past year made sense. The brochures showing families fishing at the lake, the walking trail signs, the repeated claim that residents had always enjoyed access. Rebecca hadn't invented the story herself. She had inherited it, believed it, and then doubled down every time reality challenged it. That didn't excuse what she'd done, but it made her actions easier to understand. Pride can be expensive. Pride mixed with bad information can be catastrophic. The county scheduled a mediation session before anyone spent another year fighting in court. Representatives from the HOA, several homeowners, Daniel, and I all gathered inside a plain conference room with fluorescent lights that somehow made everyone look more tired than they already were. Rebecca walked in carrying a binder almost as thick as mine. She looked older than she had only a few months earlier. The confidence was still there, but it had cracks now. Real ones. The mediator spoke first. "We are here to determine facts, not assign emotions." I liked him immediately. For nearly 3 hours we compared surveys, deeds, tax records, archive development plans, and correspondence dating back decades. Every time another document appeared, the same conclusion became harder to escape. The lake had always belonged to Cedar Run Farm. It had never been transferred, leased, dedicated, or granted for community use. Finally, the mediator turned toward Rebecca. "Do you dispute these records?" She looked down at the table. For the first time since I'd met her, there wasn't an answer waiting. "No," she said quietly. The room fell completely silent. One homeowner, an elderly veteran named Frank Miller, slowly removed his glasses. "Then why did you keep telling us otherwise?" Rebecca took a deep breath before answering. "Because that's what I was told when I joined the board. Every president before me repeated the same story. By the time I learned the truth..." She stopped. "I thought admitting we were wrong would destroy the community." Frank shook his head gently. "Instead, hiding it almost did." That sentence stayed with me long after the meeting ended. A month later, the HOA officially apologized to every homeowner and to my family. The board voted to remove every brochure, website photo, and promotional statement suggesting ownership or access to the lake. New boundary signs were installed, not because I wanted bigger fences, but because everyone finally agreed clear boundaries create better neighbors than assumptions ever will. Rebecca resigned before the next election. I didn't celebrate when I heard the news. Honestly, I felt something closer to relief than victory. She'd made serious mistakes, but somewhere along the way I'd realized she wasn't the original author of the problem. She was simply the last person stubborn enough to defend it. A new HOA president reached out a few weeks later. His first sentence surprised me. "We're not calling to ask for anything." That was a refreshing change. Instead, he asked if I'd be willing to meet over coffee and talk about how both sides could rebuild trust. We met at the old diner outside town, the one with the cracked vinyl booths and pie that somehow tastes exactly the same every year. We talked for nearly 2 hours. No lawyers, no accusations, no speeches. Just two people trying to figure out how neighbors could stop acting like opponents. Before leaving, he said something my father would have appreciated. Property lines keep people from arguing about land. Respect keeps people from arguing about everything else. A few months later, I invited several neighborhood families to fish at the lake on one condition. They had to ask first. Every single one of them smiled and said yes. It turns out permission isn't a burden. Sometimes it's simply another word for respect. Every now and then I still walk down to the dock just before sunrise with a cup of coffee in my hand. The water looks exactly the way it did when I was 10 years old. The bass still strike when they're in the mood. The herons still ignore everyone. The only thing that's really changed is me. I used to think protecting property meant defending fences. Now I know it's really about defending truth, even when the truth is inconvenient, unpopular, or slower than a good story. So let me ask you something. If you discovered your entire neighborhood believed something that wasn't true, would you keep quiet to preserve the peace, or would you risk becoming the villain in someone else's story to protect what's right? There isn't always an easy answer, and that's exactly why I'd love to hear your opinion. Leave a comment below and tell me what you would have done. If this story made you think, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more true-to-life legal and neighborhood dramas, and share it with someone who's ever had to choose between staying comfortable and standing up for the truth. Sometimes the smallest property line ends up teaching the biggest lesson.